I love Pomonok as a kid. I really love Pomonok. I came to the slums and I came from Louisa. I love Pomonok. It was like opening a dream, like looking in a crystal ball. It was just wonderful.
News on the move. Lady Liberty welcomes her brave sons back from Europe in New York Harbor. There are many cheerful reunions. Welcome home, GI. Job well done. There's no time to rest. You've got new orders, Joe. Back from the front, it's time to build a life for you and your family on the home front. But the war has taken its toll. With all efforts going to secure victory, there is a housing crisis. With 2.25 million dwellings in New York, there are only 2,000 vacancies. Mayor O'Dwyer names Robert Moses head of the Emergency Committee on Housing. State and city working together, pushing forward with $260 million in funding. Underway, projects from the New York City Housing Authority that will house 250,000 people. One such project, Pomonok Houses in Flushing, Queens, built on the historic grounds of the Pomonok Country Club. The post-war housing boom is well underway. Local 3 of the American Federation of Electrical Workers purchases the Pomonok Club and sells 53 acres to the New York City Housing Authority. The city landscapes the grounds with playgrounds, wide tree-lined walks and sitting areas, off-street parking for Dad's new car. There's even a children's nursery, a modern 3-story community center with activities and meeting rooms, and a branch of the Queens Public Library. A 3.5-acre playground is built on the corner of Casita Boulevard and 65th Avenue, and land is allocated to the future home of PS 201. September 1951. The shadows of summer grow long, thoughts of the World Series are on people's minds. The first families move into the new Pomonok housing project. Young families full of hope, following their American dream. News on the move.
Came to Pomonok in 1951.
Came here in 1952. We were the first tenants in our apartment.
We got to Pomonok in 1956.
53.
1962.
December of 1951, we were original tenants in Pomonok.
I moved into Pomonok in 1954.
My family came here in 1951.
1955.
1952.
62.
66.
63.
My father was from North Carolina. My mother was from Virginia.
I lived in the Army Barracks on 99th Street and Horace Harding Boulevard.
My family came from Brooklyn.
My parents were from Canarsie. They lived in the Quonset huts.
We lived in the Quonset hut for 5 years.
Quonset huts were temporary housing built for returning servicemen.
The semicircular building broken into 2 parts. There would be a family on one end and a family on the other end. Basically, it was just a kitchen, a very small living area, and like 2 bedrooms and a bathroom.
I remember playing outside the Quonset hut.
We had some sort of oil tank on a little bit of a platform, and I remember using that as a horse when we played Cowboys and Indians.
We came from the Lower East Side where bathrooms were in the hallway.
Typical tenement apartment is relatively small. There are only several hundred square feet, approximately 3 rooms.
It was very ethnic, crowded, teeming with people, push carts, and time to move.
I see millions whose daily lives in city and on farm continue under conditions labeled indecent by a so-called polite society half a century ago.
The Depression created a crisis that threatened the social fabric of not only New York City, but the entire nation. The decade of the 1930s saw unemployment up and business down. The tenements continued to deteriorate. With the public's loss of confidence in the private sector, progressives like Landon Post and Mary Sinkovich, along with master builder Robert Moses, pushed for housing reforms. New York City's Mayor LaGuardia created the New York City Housing Authority, comprised of devoted housing experts, and launched a massive city-funded public housing building program.
I had a friend named Marty. He was talking to me about a place out in Queens, and I was telling my wife, forget about it. Who the hell wants to move to Queens?
You're considered like a pioneer going out to Queens.
My mom wanted to move out here. My dad was reluctant. He was a street guy. He liked hanging out on the street. He wasn't accustomed to grass. Maybe he thought he was going to have to mow the lawn for the whole project.
Coming here was a different way of life, a better way of life maybe that our parents were striving to make for their children.
It was an age where there was hope, and people thought they were going to have a better life, especially for their children. It was always the children were going to live better than the parents, always.
My parents said we were going to move to the country, and that meant moving out to Queens.
Brooklyn, Bronx, you had Manhattan, but Queens? Who goes to Queens?
It was very rural in this part of Queens back then.
There were farms nearby.
There were no paved streets, sidewalks.
So when we first moved here, this was dirt. Casino Boulevard was dirt. There was no street there.
Queens was building out at the time.
Very sparsely populated.
We had bunny rabbits outside.
I can remember chasing the rabbits, chasing the pheasants.
It was like the wilds.
Pomonok emerges in an era when the modernist idea of planning was dominant. That idea was that the future of the city was a city of tower blocks with vast open spaces around them.
My dad used to say we were cliff dwellers.
7- and 3-story buildings, most of which look very much alike.
And you can look at straight up middle-income developments at the same time. Stuyvesant Town or Fresh Meadows, they all have a very similar quality to them. The lack of ornamentation, you really put the money that you have into the modern amenities for people. You have central heating plants, modern kitchen, multiple bedrooms for a family. It's elevators, which of course poor people never had in New York, or working class people mostly walked up.
The difference between having to walk up 4 or 5 flights of stairs and using an elevator, that must have been sort of a magical thing for some of these folks.
Having a building with an elevator in it, yes, that was luxurious.
Red doors on the other, green doors. I open the door by hand and close the door. Not big. These are like steel cages. There they go.
One of the scariest things at Pomonok was the incinerator, where we used to throw the garbage.
We never had garbage in the house, because as soon as the garbage was half filled, you just walked over to the incinerator, you dumped everything.
Cast iron door.
The smallest little chute.
Stuff the garbage in.
It had the sign on the top to not throw any flammable items in it.
When I had too much to put down the chute, and I remember pushing and pushing.
It was like a scandal if somebody didn't push their own garbage down.
And I'd stand there with the door open to listen to it hit the bottom.
We used to burn, incinerate garbage so that rats, mice, all those things could not embed themselves in the garbage.
I used to love to look in there and see if I could see the flame. Sometimes the fire would come out the incinerator. We would have fire engines here at least once a month because somebody didn't do the job right.
People were moving from older tenement buildings directly into newly constructed housing complexes. A beautiful apartment with air, light, open space, modern central heat, windows in every room. For many families coming from congested quarters, this was a transformation in living, a tremendous step up.
If I say to somebody that I grew up in a New York City housing project, I think that their view is probably very different than what was reality. I think they think of some crime-filled, poor, dirty, rat-infested environment, and because that's kind of the image that city housing has today.
Get into public housing.
There was a waiting list and everything.
They had strict rules of entry, and there would be a full background check done. There were what were known as the 21 factors. If you had, for instance, a criminal record or substance abuse record, you were unmarried, you had a kind of a case history with a social service agency and so forth, you weren't going to get into public housing. Here's the interesting thing, though. The minority tenants who came in the 40s and 50s and 60s had to come through the 21 factors just the same. So you see basically a majority-minority population that essentially had middle-class tenants, middle-class values, were intact families, working families. This was very good from the public housing's perspective of getting tenants who could pay rents, had work.
Families were really high quality.
And that was the vision of the people behind public housing.
was gorgeous here.
Everything was so nice and clean and fresh.
It's considered one of the crown jewels of the housing development.
In the post-war era, when you look at the landscaping at first, it's these enormous expanses of grass. This kind of green lawn surrounding it. It's with a small chain link fence around it.
2.5 feet high.
That you weren't supposed to walk on. You have a series of benches lining it for older people to sit, and maybe little children to play. These become kind of the streets of the neighborhood. And then you have these lines of trees. Very formal landscape treatment, like estates of the people.
You wanted to just keep walking outside and meeting your neighbors.
Pomonok was really a pretty place.
It was so beautiful.
It was always well kept. People kept it also.
If there was garbage, you picked it up. If you spilled something, you made sure it was cleaned up, because this is where we lived.
There was a sense of pride.
They knew what they had. Subsidies on the rents, a great 2-bedroom apartment that they probably couldn't afford.
What's interesting about New York is that they didn't have any problem with the idea of government-subsidized housing. They knew how good the housing they were getting was. They realized that this was a tremendous opportunity.
They treated us so nice here. As soon as you call up for repairs, they came right away.
They kept it up very well.
If you go back to the 1930s when public housing starts in New York, their idea is to basically bring higher quality housing to the working class of the city. And what that meant to them was not simply the apartment itself, but the system of management. You have an entire infrastructure of workers who look after and keep up the buildings.
Each cluster of buildings had a porter.
They're organized in a very hierarchical, almost military manner.
Blue archer had the blue pants, tons of keys. Sure had a little round silver badge with a number on it.
They kept the buildings clean.
They took real good care of the buildings.
They were the top.
There's some descriptions from the 1950s and 60s where people were kind of marched out to their individual buildings, right? Things had to be ship-shape and shined up. There really was this sort of idea in this era of high quality delivered to the tenants.
They used to shine the banisters.
The porters used to shine the brass.
He would wash the floors another day.
And the buildings were immaculate.
Immaculate.
Immaculate. Immaculate. Immaculate.
And those porters were there and prominent and part of the fabric of Pomonok.
It's this idea that even though the people in public housing didn't have a lot of money, that didn't mean that they shouldn't have the same quality of service as more affluent residents of modern housing. One thing that happened in the 1930s was that the Housing Authority adopted a civil service system of hiring, which definitely distinguished New York from other cities. It's not to say there wasn't any patronage in public housing, but compared to the overwhelming dominance of patronage in other cities, that makes a big difference in whether people show up for their jobs, know what they're doing. In New York, the housing management has been instrumental in shifting from the idea of just buildings that you basically put people in to an idea of a human system.
It's important to realize that the city projects, by and large, were constructed to higher standards than the federal and state projects of the time.
It is, housing is not simply just a place where you dump people, right, in one part of the city, but you have an entire infrastructure of workers who are there, who look after and keep up the building. There have always been some problems in public housing, but the difference in New York is that somebody comes through on a regular basis and cleans up. Distinguishes New York from other cities where they basically created these large public housing projects and then walked away from them, and then were very surprised when there was vandalism, other kinds of problems.
I didn't know that there was subsidized housing. I didn't even know that I was in a housing project. It was only years later that when I would tell someone that I came from Pomonok, and I saw that they went like, oh, that there was any negative. I did not know that when I went to Alexander's or I went to Gertz or whatever, that there was better. I was happy.
You have all these caretakers and porters and housing assistants, people looking out, because this is also about social control. The people who were in charge of the Housing Authority didn't believe housing was enough. And their whole idea of housing was that it was a new idea of community.
It takes a village
To raise a child.
Pomonok was like just one big family.
A lot of kids running around.
You had 1 million friends.
There were enough kids in just one court, not to mention all the rest of the project. There was just kids everywhere.
It was almost as if no one was allowed to move into this project unless they had children.
We left the house in the morning
and we came home at night.
We were outside from sun up to sundown. We were out here all the time.
You didn't want to be upstairs. You wanted to be outside.
We went to school, came home, did our homework, and as long as it was daylight, we went out and played.
What were we going to do at home? If you had a TV, it was black and white, and you had maybe 2 or 3 channels.
Robert Moses would come along in the 50s, and he would say, well, we'll put a playground next door to the public housing project.
Park was the place.
The big move to venture out of the court was to come down to 201 Park.
It's a city playground within a walking distance of the public housing project.
It's a 7-minute walk from my house to the park, and I walked that walk a million times.
All you had to do was cross a small street, and we were gone for the day.
Be 100 kids walking to the park, and you have to stop and say hello to every one of them because everybody knew everybody.
If you didn't have 50 kids to play with on a given day, something was wrong.
We were in a small village, and people's parents looked out for other people's kids.
I never concerned myself about where they were or what they were doing, because I knew that they were being supervised and someone was aware of them and knew them.
When we were on the streets, everybody knew everybody in this neighborhood.
Everyone watched out for everyone.
No one turned their back on other people's children.
And I think we did feel responsible for each other.
I really felt like I was a child of the community.
I don't remember too many babysitters. There was always a neighbor or something that watched you if your parents went out.
If my mother and father were working, Miss Ryan, who lived next door, would help me, and watch out for myself and my sisters.
If you were getting into trouble, somebody was going to yell out the window.
And if you did something wrong, boy, you had to answer to someone else's mother, too.
They were like your second parents.
Robert, cut it out.
Mom, if you don't stop that, I'm going to tell your mother.
If you did wrong,
If you did something wrong, by the time you got home,
Your parents knew all about it.
So now you're suffering the wrath of your neighbor, and now you're going to get the wrath from your parents.
My parents had friends that had the right to smack me and send me home so I can get the other smack.
I do remember so many nice people and walking around and sitting outside and knowing everybody and feeling safe.
Never afraid when I lived in Pomonok. I used to stay out at night in front of the building.
When you were in this neighborhood, you just felt a sense of safety.
There was no question about safety. My mother was more worried about boys.
I was more fearful about the Cold War than I was about walking home from a babysitting job at 3 o'clock in the morning. There were some nights when I'd hear the planes and I thought that the Russians were coming and they were going to drop an atomic bomb. The bad guys were not here. The bad guys were outside of us. And this was a very, very protected, wonderful place.
It wasn't as highly mixed racially as it is today.
Pomonok houses was well known to be primarily white.
We were like 13 or 14 families, African American, when we moved in here.
Pomonok houses was integrated compared to housing projects in the 1950s, places like Harlem, East New York.
there were like 4 flavors growing up here in Pomonok, with Jewish, Italian, Irish, or African American.
It's very important to understand that places like Levittown, just a few miles from the city border, are openly excluding minority families in the 1950s, while integrated housing is quietly taking root in city developments like Pomonok.
This is the era when essentially the ethnics were becoming white. They're assimilating into American culture at a very rapid clip. Instead of being the foreign oddity in a tenement neighborhood, you're becoming part of the modern American mainstream, moving to a place like Pomonok. They're basically shedding a lot of the sort of distinctive ethnic identity.
We didn't know that we were different.
New York had a more open view about race relations.
We didn't know that you had to have race relations because there were no problems.
It didn't really strike me that that wasn't the way the world was supposed to be.
We were totally colorblind in Pomonok. We did not know if you were white or black, or if you were Jewish or Christian. It didn't make a difference.
That's America, and that's part of what I liked about it. We're Jewish, her best friend Cassie, Italian, my next door neighbor, black. I love that.
Our parents never talked about our differences or ethnicity.
One of my best friends from childhood was black, and her name was Ruby Scriven. Ruby said to me she never knew she was black until she went to junior high school and started liking boys. She never knew the difference. I never knew the difference.
It wasn't a black and white thing. We didn't even see that. We didn't even notice that. Your brother Gary looked out for my little brother Stanley.
When we got married, it's probably in some states it was illegal
Yeah,
to
it was. We got
marry.
married
You
in
kidding?
67.
Just finished the war against the Nazis. I never thought about the fact that somebody was black or I was white or I was Jewish and they weren't Jewish.
I used to call Pomonok the United Nations.
There was just an eclectic mix of cultures and religions and bar mitzvahs and confirmations.
In September of '62, I went to Gabe Cohen bar mitzvah, and back then we were wearing very, very tight pants. And one of the first words in Yiddish I learned was when his uncle came up to me. He looked at my tight pants, right? And he said, "Where do you have room for your schmeckel?"
Everybody respected everybody's holidays. If you had a Christmas tree, you'd invite the Jewish kids over. And if you did Passover, your friends came over for matzah.
Do remember this homogeneous kind of decency.
We all had something in common. Nobody had any money.
That's why we were in the projects.
Nobody had nothing in the 50s.
Nobody had a lot of money. These were all working class families.
Mostly white, working middle class, lower middle class.
Pomonok houses is part of that city-funded or no-cash subsidy program. And what this meant was that the rents of the tenants were basically designed to cover the operating costs, to be essentially self-supporting. They had higher rents. If you were going to be charging higher rents, that meant you had to have tenants with higher incomes. In this period, the majority of the people in the city who had higher incomes were white. There were higher income African Americans and Puerto Ricans, but there was a smaller number.
Most people made $5,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 a year.
My father served in the Army Air Corps as a radio instructor. The job market wasn't too good at that point in time, and people were going into jobs that weren't necessarily related to their academic training.
My father drove a truck in the city. He was a typical blue-collar World War II veteran guy.
My father was a seasonal worker. He was a blotto milling hats.
Father was a plumber.
Limo driver.
Social worker.
Meat cutter.
Taxi driver.
Retailer.
My father worked for the New York City Transit Authority.
Clothing business.
A plastics manufacturer.
Interior decorating.
A boxing referee.
A letter carrier.
My father was a baker by trade. He became a union organizer.
I'm very proud of my own man, I am. I always brag about him. He was a fireman, became a battalion chief, because they had a picture on the front page of the Daily News around 1950 when he carried an elderly woman out of a burning building.
My father actually worked for the development. He was a maintenance man.
To build public housing not on the subway lines was a very interesting choice, and again shows the sense that these are essentially kind of working class, middle class people. They're going to have higher incomes who will have access to automobiles. So we're not going to be worried about isolating them.
My father was like the mayor. He wasn't a politician, but he was like the mayor of the parking lot. He hung out, and his buddies hung out. And they watched each other's car. Nobody should touch them. They shouldn't park too close. You have an equal distance between them.
It didn't feel like we were lacking anything.
It was an overall sense of comfort.
I don't remember envy. I don't remember jealousy. These were good people who were not swept up.
Nobody cared about what you had.
We didn't have money, but we had values.
There was clearly a premium that my parents and everybody else's parents, as far as I could tell, were putting on education. There was always the expectation at home that you were going to do the work that you needed to do and that you would do it well and that you would get good grades.
The value was to study hard.
Very few kids played hooky in those days.
PS 201.
That was a great school. I really enjoyed every minute of it.
The education was always top-notch. Didn't matter how much money you have, you had the opportunities, just like anybody else in any part of the city or on Long Island.
Mr. Moses was the principal.
Edward Moses, he was a great principal.
He was a psychologist in his background, but he was the first principal of the school, a phenomenal leader, and a wonderful philosophy of education, was concerned about parents, including them, and their impact.
Moses was the big guy, but he wasn't the enforcer. The assistant principal was Levinson. I remember him taking Paul Schneer once and bouncing him off the wall. Paul Schneer now is an attorney that fights for people's rights.
The teachers really were involved.
Mrs. Rosenthal.
Mrs. Rosenzweig.
Mrs. Brown.
Mrs. Duncan.
Hal Berman. Ed Berkowitz.
Mrs. Goodhart.
Mrs. Amaron.
Kathleen Coogan.
Warren Wheelock.
Nat Kuznets.
Mrs. Alexander.
Addie Moskowitz.
Miss Fox.
All master teachers.
I wound up working with the disabled kids, which I thought was really nice for all of us to learn, how to be tolerant.
I had an amazing first grade teacher. Her name was Dorothy Applewhite. Many of us left first grade reading on sixth grade levels. That was in 1954, when there were not too many African-American teachers.
My first recollections of PS 201 was at 5 years old, my parents walking me there and crying all day.
I have a twin brother, Steve. The first day of school, we go into kindergarten. We're wearing these little sports jackets with bow ties and a vest. My mother films us walking in. And then when we come out, brother comes out with his sports jacket, his vest, and his tie. And here I come. My shirt tail hanging out, tied the wrong way. You can really see the eventual personalities that we would have.
Remember the dance festivals in the school?
Oh, yeah.
We would have dance festivals at the end of every year.
That was the beginning of summer.
All the parents would come and bring their lawn chairs and set up around the outside fence of the softball field. Each class would go up and do the dances that they had spent half a year learning how to do.
Education was foremost and important. We were very committed to parents and to the whole child and what was happening at home as well as in school.
It was like an integrated whole. The parents, the school, the kids were all in it together. And even though kids would moan and groan about what they had to do at school, just like any kids did, deep down they knew that they had to do it.
It was a very special place.
There's a huge Boy Scouts community in Pomonok.
3 Cub Scout packs, 3 Boy Scout troops, and 2 Explorer posts.
The Scouts were a very significant part of the community, a significant source of friends.
There were dads like Ed Katz and Lester Hochstein, who always found time for the kids.
My dad got involved as a leader and eventually served as the president of the Parents of Pomonok Scouts.
I was in Mr. Dresner's Boy Scout troop, here Troop 183.
We had some really good times on the camping trips, and you learned to build fires, you learned to cook. Everything was done in a team. Learned a lot of life things. And the leader of the Explorer troop was Mary Juvelier.
He was a man who seriously cared about the boys of the neighborhood. He was a highly decorated war hero.
I was there for a long time, from the Cub Scouts through midway through my senior year in high school. So I went all the way up to the Eagle Scout.
People were very political. When a president came, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, it was a very, very big event.
Kennedy came through.
He was up at Parsons and Jewell.
Down by Letchester.
This was the seat of the middle class. This is where union workers live. This is where you came to campaign.
Crowds were incredible, how many people came out to see him.
I was 16 years old at the time. It was a euphoria in the air.
Support for Kennedy among the people of Pomonok, please. Everybody for Kennedy.
There was an announcement that Kennedy is about 10 minutes away. Kennedy's 5 minutes away.
The motorcade came right up Parsons Boulevard.
We had paper all torn up, and when he came by, we threw it in the air.
He was shaking hands, patting kids on the head.
Felt like he was looking right at you. He seemed to have this great tan and his great teeth.
I was rooting for this rock star to become president.
He was so dynamic.
When
People say, where'd you grow up? I said, well, nowadays you would call it a tenement or a project, and it would have a negative connotation to it. But back in those days, it didn't.
Our mothers would yell, come home and eat. We didn't want to go home. We wanted to play sports.
The progressives' idea of an integrated community extended to the courts, the playgrounds, and the parks, where black and white children played together.
Sports kept everybody active and friendly.
Sports was my life. Sports was a lot of people's life.
I would come down here every morning in the summer. I lived here.
It was a tremendous sense of order. All self-organized. We didn't have adults there, but we didn't have massive arguments.
Guys played hard-nosed. We didn't call no stupid fouls. We just played the game.
You lost, you walked off the court. Someone else came on.
Everybody used to compete against each other for fun.
If you wanted to be famous in Pomonok, then you could dunk that basket.
Pomonok spawned some amazing basketball players. Sandy Lewis, Derek Scott, Georgie Strickland, Kenny Trush, and Stan Gersh, to name a few.
I was like one of the smallest guys, but I was the fastest.
Woo! This is Mr. Al Stark.
Al Stark used to look out for us.
Melvin Rouse organized this trip to take 3 teams to play their teams in Philly.
The good thing about going to Philly was the experience. Here you had kids, some of them have never left the park, are now on a bus going to another city. We went as a family.
My brother Lloyd came as one of the coaches.
And that's Lloyd. God bless his soul. Fruity, much respect. This is my man CB, Chili Bell. He was 2 years older than us, but he saw our flavor, so that's why I'm gonna hang with them young guys.
The growth, the maturity that came from just being out of the neighborhood and going somewhere else, you can't buy that.
That's me.
Melvin organized the whole thing. I give him a lot of credit.
My dude right here, he bust me up.
This building had the greatest echo. The echo is incredible.
You would see guys singing on the corners in the 1950s.
And singing vocal harmony tunes, what they call today doo-wops.
And I always noticed the girls seemed to like that.
I want only, I want your love.
This building here, my friend Paul Titone lived up on a 7-story 7D. Howie Goose Garrett lived up there in 3D. Gary Sellickson, David Zidow, Bobby Schiller lived in that building. Building 13 was always the water tower. Because you can see how many benches, it was a big area to hang out. Between fences, building, bushes, grass, slides, seesaws. Kids were very inventive in the 1950s.
We didn't have something to do, we'd make something to do.
We created games.
It could rain, you'd go play in somebody's house.
The rainy days were the tough, but we used to play Nerf football, tackle each other in the living room, throw each other on the couch.
As the ratio of children went up, they needed more active recreation spaces, and that's where you get more playgrounds on the grounds of public housing, like monkey bars.
We had a corral in the park, and we play on the inside of the corral, and we walk on the top of the corral.
Animals.
Hanging out in the turtle. Turtle was awful comfortable to sit on.
They had these big barrels.
Cast concrete sewer pipes.
Everybody played in the barrel.
I can't bend like I used to.
Hang out inside the barrel. You could climb on the barrel. It was a horse, it was a house, it was whatever you wanted it to be.
And those are still around. This stuff was so durable, it's really hard to get rid of it.
Did you sing in here?
No.
A lot of the things that we did were unisex things, because Skelly, you know, the girls played the guy.
Lots of Skelly, lots of Skelly.
And you took a crayon and a match.
Melt the crayons
into the bottle caps.
So it had some heft. Sometimes you put a lead washer in there
To give them the right weight to slide.
Skelly was a box game.
and we get down on the hands and knees on the concrete.
And with your middle finger or else your index finger, you would shoot.
When we weren't playing Barbie dolls in someone's house, we were playing Scully.
We lived through an amazing time in American history.
I remember coming home, and my mother's friend and a neighbor came running into the house screaming that the president had been shot.
Very similar to 9/11 in that it was kind of like a an eerie silence.
And so began a new era of turmoil and reflection that gave all of us a new understanding of what it meant to be an American.
The first people who went with volunteers, when they started drafting hundreds of thousands of American young men, then protests started.
But the Vietnam thing, it managed our life.
I got drafted in '68. It was the biggest draft year in United States history.
Most of us did whatever we could to stay out. That's why you have so many school teachers here, because school teachers were deferred.
Ellie and me were in the service at the same time. My third day in Vietnam, we ran into each other. So here we are on the other side of the world in a war zone. We got to see each other.
What are the odds of that? It just helped me feel normal.
A bunch of us would gather in Pomonok and we'd walk to the World's Fair, 1964. We had this idea that anything near our neighborhood, we should be entitled to get into for free. We would literally walk into the World's Fair backwards when hundreds of people would be walking out forwards, and we would always get in.
To me, the World's Fair was 100 times better than Disney. Every pavilion had so many exciting things. The Uniroyal Ferris wheel with the big tire.
The world of tomorrow. Video phones and rocket ships.
It was only a matter of a few years before these things all came into being.
Talking about Pomonok. Know what I'm talking about.
We've always had a great interest in music, all of us. We loved the Beach Boys, Lovin' Spoonful, the 60s groups.
We were called the Bathtub Ring.
I was a lead singer because I couldn't play an instrument.
And I sang and played bass.
Gary Barbagallo, Flip.
Played drums. Ricky Hyman, who had the only talent in the group, was a guitarist. And then we thought we were it. We had that little feeling of, you know, we were rock stars.
If you want to know doo-wop, you want to know soul and rock, come to Pomonok.
Pomonok was a creative thing that really doesn't ever end.
It was beautiful in the summer.
It was just peaceful.
The weather was warm.
It was quiet. You heard the birds singing in the morning.
We didn't have air conditioning.
Dreaded going inside.
Windows had to be open.
I don't think they even had screens on the windows, so you had to deal with mosquitoes.
Just got bit up.
If you were lucky, could afford it, you bought a fan.
I would turn the fan 2 inches to me. I'd wake up a half hour later and see the fan was aimed to him.
The big term was cross-ventilation.
My father, he was probably, open the windows and put one fan in one window. You get cross-ventilation.
We faced east and we faced south.
Getting this hot, humid air sucked in from one window, blowing out the other.
The reality is we got warm winds from the south and storms from the east.
It felt like a sauna, man.
The moms would sit on the bench, and so because they were down there, we'd be out really late at night and just hanging out with our friends.
Hanging out.
Yeah.
We used to sit out behind the house, and everybody brought their chairs, all the men, all the women after dinner. We used to sit out till 3 o'clock in the morning. We would sit and talk and laugh and have a couple of drinks.
You sit on the bench like a social group there.
And as a result, you got to know your neighbors.
They used to sit out on a stoop. I love that. I love that.
Because the parents were all together, the children bonded.
Children, teens, parents, grandparents, we all stayed out there hoping for some cool air breeze.
Lightning bugs.
Hunting for beetles.
Tons of fireflies.
Mosquitoes buzzing around your head. Right after dinner, the punchball game was.
Everybody was together until you had to go to sleep.
We'd stay out to sometimes 9, 10 o'clock at night. For a kid that's 6, 7 years old, that was big.
My father's one of the few people who had an 8mm camera. He got it in 1950. He was like a frustrated director. His treat were to perform in the movies. He created these little vignettes, The Mortgage, The Kidnapper, The Sheik. Pocahontas. He would make signs, like a silent movie, and we'd perform outside. And my mother would make costumes, but thank God for him.
Mary Simkovich, one of the founders of public housing, she was the head of Greenwich House, a settlement house. And they didn't like the idea of children just kind of like playing by themselves, right? They liked organized play. What they didn't like were the streets. And so she pushed for this idea of a community center. So it's organized play. It's not just, do your own thing kind of play. What they were looking for was an idea of community. This comes out of the settlement houses.
I went to the community center all the time.
I joined the community center. I was about 7, 8 years old.
We used to go down there and do arts and crafts.
Played the clarinet there.
Spin art. Made lanyards.
Keychains, necklaces.
Wood shop.
Ceramics.
Metal shop. Skittles.
Knock hockey.
Pool. Ping pong. The Queens Public Library was on the top floor of the community center.
I actually had my bar mitzvah reception in the Pomonok Community Center.
My mom, Miss Ella McNeil, was the assistant director. She was there all the time. She would always take good care of us.
Mr. Daddario.
Everybody just knew him as Mr. D.
God bless Mr. D. He was an amazing man.
He was the center of the center.
I'm Lee Daddario. I was here for a 20-year sentence, but I'll tell you, it was the best 20 years of my life.
Mr. D, he ran the show.
He was in charge of everything.
I used to call him the Pied Piper. All the children, the minute they saw him, would follow.
He was a great guy who really cared about kids and really cared about the neighborhood.
He was one of the real legends in the community and a very stabilizing force.
Mr. D was sort of like a surrogate father.
We were all his kids.
Another adult who was looking out for you.
Really helped get me through with his understanding.
He knew who you were. He knew your name. We didn't have much as kids. We got very few presents. You got a bicycle if you were lucky. But he made our summers enjoyable, our nights in the night center enjoyable.
When you talk about giving, and for real, that's Mr. D. Mr. D is the essence of giving in my world.
Let's play ball, all right?
Jack the ice cream man.
The infamous Jack the ice cream man.
He was a piece of work. Jack used to start here like March, April, and work his way through October.
He made enough money for the day just working Pomonok. I don't even know if he had to work other neighborhoods.
You always knew where he was going to be, and if you missed him, you could run because you knew where his next stop was in the next court.
He was the calendar. When the winter would go away, you'd hear Jack, the ice cream man.
You'd hear the bells ringing.
Da-ding, da-ding, da-ding. Jingle, jingle, jingle.
And you knew Jack was coming down. Jack the ice cream man would come along, and all of a sudden you see 100 tissues being thrown out the window.
Mom!
Ma, Jack's here.
Mom, throw down 15 cents.
Ma, I need a nickel, I need a nickel.
She would wrap it up in paper,
And the windows would open.
and she'd toss it out the window.
And it comes whistling down.
Here it comes. Yeah.
Every time that he rang the bell, I remember I used to go there and get ice cream.
He had 2 trucks.
Had a small little truck, like a good Yuma truck.
Then he got the van. He didn't have to move. And he'd stay there for 2 hours.
He had this truck that sold everything.
Sold hot dogs, candy.
He had baseball cards. He had tops.
Bazooka gum.
Candy apples.
Pumpkin seeds.
Sodas.
One hot dog was 15 cents, 2 for $1.
He knew our names. He knew everything about us.
I used to go to Jack and I'd give him $quarter and I'd ask him for the usual. He'd give me a Marino's Ices and a Twizzlers licorice and 4 pieces of Bazooka bubble gum.
If there was a parent out there buying ice cream for their child, then everybody got ice cream.
I love that chocolate cake pop.
A vanilla ice cream pop.
Push-up stick.
The coconut bars.
Popsicle.
The creamsicle.
Marino's Ice.
Chocolate or cola.
The flavor really came through at the bottom.
And even if you didn't have enough money, he still gave you your ice cream.
He would have these incredible contests.
He would organize tournaments for, like, spinning tops.
His yo-yo contest.
Hula hoop contest was just this amazing event that Jack orchestrated.
Right here in this court. Whoever was able to keep the hula hoop going the longest won the contest.
It was really exciting, and I was doing really well, and I thought I had a pretty good chance to win. And someone came by and knocked my hula hoop. Looked forward to those things. It seemed like kids just came out of the woodwork, and they were really, really fun.
He owned the turf.
10, 15 years, Jack was the only guy.
One summer, the good humor guy shows up. You know, this young, good-looking guy trying to sell his good humor ice cream. And now Jack, the ice cream man, has competition.
It was a good humor guy and Jack.
I definitely remember him and the good humor guy going at it. They had some pretty strong words. And Jack was telling the guy, look, this is my turf. I've been here for years. I don't want you selling your ice cream here. This is my turf.
He hated if you bought anything from Good Humor.
That would push Jack's buttons.
You were an enemy.
Jack didn't like
Jack was pissed off.
He would give you a hard time.
He would ban you.
Banned for life.
I remember my mother telling me, don't buy from anybody else but Jack, because I don't want to hear it.
Sometimes you were like, where's Jack? What's up with Jack? He's not here. Well, he'd say, someone told me I saw you with the good humor truck. It wasn't me, Jack.
In my hand was a Good Humor pop, and I went to pay, and he literally went like this. Don't let me see that again. And I went, no, Jack, no, Jack.
And at the end of the summer, every year, Jack would just give away everything on the truck. Gave out free ice cream right there every October.
Right, that's right.
Florida, right at that spot.
We knew that the season, the summer, was officially over.
I don't remember him. He never came on Jewel Avenue. We had Tony the ice cream man.
I remember some tough winters.
We used to get a lot of snow. Tons of snow.
Back then, we had some pretty big snowstorms.
There were certain winters that had extraordinary features. Like the winter of 60-61 had 3 giant snowstorms. We were out of school forever that year. It was a 15-incher, an 18-incher, a 13-incher. Then there were winters where it got -2, -3, -4. The winters were snowy and snowless, but they were colder. And they always had more snow on the ground for longer periods of time, so the ice would settle.
But it didn't keep us in.
Mom would bundle us up with like layers and layers of clothes.
You'd put on maybe 2 pair of pants.
We'd go out and play in the snow.
And you wouldn't come home until you were sopping wet and freezing.
Times where you couldn't even get out of the building.
Snow was above the car. You literally couldn't move.
It was all about sleigh riding.
We used to do a lot of sleigh riding.
To go sleigh riding on the hill.
The big hill everybody liked in Pomonok was between building 12 and 13. You went down that hill, you could go well past the sidewalk.
We probably had about 50 people where it should have only held about 10 people.
Sled riding down those hills was exuberant.
There were an awful lot of kids, an awful lot of sleds.
As you were walking up the hill, you avoided people coming right down that. You'd have to jump over them.
My mother couldn't afford to get us a sled, but we would cut up a box and we would just jump on each other's backs.
I didn't have a sled. I used to slide down on Arthur Cone.
We'd have snowball fights.
10 against 10, hide behind the trees.
Come and get us. We'd go attack another court, and they'd come and attack us. Court number 2. We rocked it, man.
think about people I met at work or over the years who grew up in different cities, and they probably had to be in their college years or even beyond before they actually encountered as many people as I would have met in Pomonok just growing up.
Because you grew up with so many people, so many families, different backgrounds, similar backgrounds, you learn how to be nice to people, you learn how to survive with people that have different ideas.
I consider myself unique in where I'm living now because of Pomonok, because of all these kids that I knew growing up, and I still know.
Most people, when you tell them you still have friends from like 5, 6 years old, they don't believe you.
Somehow you had this bond that was created, lasted for life.
You don't find friends like you did when you were younger.
My best friend, Eileen Grand, lived next door to me. We were literally in our mother's wombs together before we met. We still see each other.
My girlfriend, Rhonda Gold, I met when I was 6 months old. She was 3 months old, 60-year friendship.
Michael Oganello, me and him have been friends since kindergarten.
I've been friends with Cindy for over 40 years, and she's like the sister I never had.
Oh, thank you.
Bette and Gennady, they lived on my 5th floor. We know each other over 30 years.
We go out to dinner with 2 or 3 couples, and but I know a lot of people. And 2 of the other couples out of the 3 or 4 are from Pomonok. I mean, these are friendships that last a lifetime.
I'm 69, and I know these guys over 60 years, and they're still very, very close friends of mine.
We grew up with the same people. We went to the same schools.
We've been married now for 41 years.
I would say it was a Pomonok romance.
Definitely a Pomonok romance.
This penny is about a trip I took 35 years ago with my friend Robert Simonovsky. We're up in Forest Park. A train is coming down the tracks, and Simo says, put a penny on the tracks for a keepsake. We'll see if we know each other 10 years from now. So here's the penny, and it's 35 years later, and we still know each other.
I'm proud to say that most of the people I know who are from Pomonok are very successful today, did very well, and have the same positive feelings.
I'm a lawyer. I work for a not-for-profit.
I'm a lawyer. I do litigation.
Successful actors.
The Bodyguard, Goodfellas, Dumb and Dumber.
This is my recurring character, Rom, on Deep Space Nine. Never had an action figure before, and it's kind of nice.
A track and field coach at the University of Richmond.
I'm the director of maintenance training for New York City Transit Department of Buses.
A meteorologist.
Worked as a pharmacist for 30 years.
I'm in the insurance industry, and I own 3 restaurants.
Retired New York City detective.
I worked for the government for 30 years.
I'm music director of the Northport Symphony Orchestra, Northport, Long Island.
Got a doctorate in chiropractic. I've been in practice for almost 30 years.
Started a music foundation for people with disabilities. Judges, airline pilot, sanitation worker, sports memorabilia, railroad conductor, Secret Service agent, assemblyman, advertising executive, New York State Troop, research scientist, mailman, special ed teacher, movie theater owner, college advisor, sword master, real estate broker, optometrist, social worker, director of global marketing, college professor.
Most of my life, I have worked with children. As a magician, a clown, a balloon twister, I've always felt it's a nice thing to do to give back a tiny bit. Here we go. It's Mr. Pomonok.
It was a place that cultivated a lot of good people.
In the 1990s, we brought people back for reunions. They came back from out of town. We had almost 400 people here. Mr. D came back.
About 3 years ago, I started this group on Facebook called it Pomonok. We decided to have these Pomonok Electchester reunions.
It's like time has stood still. There's no walls there. There's just old friends getting together.
Walked out of my car. The first thing I did was walk over to my building. I actually cried because it just brought back so many memories.
We're telling stories left and right as if it happened yesterday.
They give you a name, you see a face, and you go, I remember you.
It's always been a source of a warm feeling when I meet someone from Pomonok.
You meet people, and in 3 minutes you feel the comfort. It's always there. It doesn't go away. Every memory we have is in Pomonok. Nowhere else than we live do we ever have that kind of relationship with people.
Long time no see.
There were actually people at the time who criticized the housing authority for not just building for the poorest people. You have to realize public housing is not designed in New York as a welfare system. The vision of the people behind public housing is to have working class, middle class tenants who are intact families, working families. And then that begins to break down in the late 60s when basically the welfare department and others in the city began saying, well, you know, this is stuff that was built by the city, by the government. Why are these working class, middle class people living there? The advocates of public housing saw it as a tool of urban transformation, that they were going to transform whole neighborhoods and districts and make a higher quality of housing for an enormous group of people. And so if we just make housing for the poorest people, well, that will be a limited subset, and that will create, one, financial problems because we won't be able to collect the rents we need, right? And two, that will create social issues. Well, they were right.
I don't like what Pomonok has become.
The neighborhood has changed an awful lot.
We can't fail to consider the possibility that public housing was a time that was right for one time, might not be right for our time.
In 1968, the New York City Housing Authority abandoned the 21 factors, leading to a greater percentage of residents on public assistance. Family incomes in Pomonok, and even federal subsidies, have not kept up with the cost of maintaining the buildings, leading to decades of deferred maintenance. The New York City Housing Authority has struggled to maintain this vast complex with a much smaller staff on site.
It's changed a lot. Even from the 15 years that I've been here, everything is just different.
Today, the racial balance has changed. Also the economics. There are people who are unemployed. They're required to take in a certain amount of people who are on public assistance now, based on racial quotas now.
Back when I first moved here, we'll just call the management office, get a ticket, and have the maintenance man will come the same day to fix the problem. But now we have to call a 24-hour service, and that takes forever.
While New York City has committed $46 million to new roofs and windows, one estimate finds that Pomonok needs over $200 million to return it to its glory days of the 50s.
I don't think there'll ever be a time like we experienced.
I think it's possible.
I don't think it could ever happen anymore.
I hope so.
Public housing was valuable in the 1950s, and it's just as valuable today.
95 out of 100% of the people
Are good, hard-working people
who are trying their best to maintain.
There needs to be more Pomonoks built today.
When you think about restoring, reviving a place like Pomonok, you need to use imagination. There were imaginative people back in the 20s and 30s who came up with the idea and the ways and means to build the place. We need new imagination and fresh ideas.
My mom and dad moved into this apartment building in 1951 with my brother and sister, apartment 6A. And I was born here in Pomonok in 1954. As I look back, I realized just how fortunate I was to have far-sighted, open-minded parents, smart enough to take advantage of the unique opportunity that the city was offering them. I think my parents were pioneers. You know, they were innovators of their time. They were part of a special group of New Yorkers who moved into public housing and created a community that best prepared their children for life in a complicated world.
I'm in the Middle East about to go into a meeting with a guy whose first name is Prince, or Your Majesty. And I say, boy, it's a long way from Pomonok.
Pomonok, I think, is their actual pronunciation.
I'm not sure what the word means.
I have no clue.
I don't know.
I don't know.
It's an Indian word. Sacred Native American ground.
I think a Chief Pomonok, the Pompano
Indian tribe.
Tribal name of a group of people, indigenous people, was Pomonok.
Pomonok was made popular by Walt Whitman. He taught here across the street in a one-room schoolhouse.
I don't know what it means, but there was local Indians here.
Pomonok means spring. This was our Garden of Eden.
For me, it means community.
It's roots. Roots. Yeah, that's it. Roots. Good word.
To me, it means good memories.
Family, my friends,
It means everything.
my history.
It means home.
If it wasn't for me living in Pomonok, I would have never came to know God and became a minister.
I didn't appreciate it when I was a kid, but now as an adult, when I look back, it was like living in a little town.
Everybody cared for each other.
It was all comforting.
It nurtured us.
I wouldn't trade growing up with the friends in this neighborhood for anything.
If I had to do it over again, I would do it just the same way. It would be right here in Pomonok.
If you looked at what the city was trying to accomplish and what it actually did accomplish in Pomonok, it truly did develop probably a working middle class type of housing project. And I think that the concept and the reality of what came out of the concept worked very, very well for us.
It was like magic.